A man can be himself only so long as he is alone. Arthur Schopenhauer. In a world obsessed with constant connection, few fears are as pervasive and as quietly destructive as the fear of being alone. For many men, solitude feels like a verdict of failure, a silent confirmation of inadequacy. Yet Schopenhauer, with his uncompromising clarity, argued the opposite. Solitude is not a punishment. It is a path to authenticity. But why do so many men dread it? The truth is harsh. Most men fear being alone because they have never truly met themselves. They fill their lives with noise, distractions, and relationships, not out of desire, but out of avoidance. They fear the silence, because in that silence, the questions arise, the ones they've been running from. In this video, we'll confront Schopenhauer's hard-hitting, inconvenient truth about men's fear of being alone. We'll explore why this fear enslaves you, how it sabotages your relationships, and how facing it head-on is the key to reclaiming your power. Subscribe if you're ready to face yourself with brutal honesty. Like and stay until the end to understand why solitude is not your enemy, but your greatest ally. Schopenhauer's philosophy begins with an uncomfortable premise. Human life is inherently marked by suffering, much of it self-inflicted through illusions of desire. Among these illusions, the fear of being alone stands as one of the most deceptive and enslaving. For men, this fear is not simply about physical solitude, it is about emotional insignificance. From a young age, men are conditioned to equate their worth with external validation, attention from peers, admiration from women, respect from society. Solitude in this framework feels like failure, but Schopenhauer reveals a deeper truth. This fear is not born from solitude itself, but from an unwillingness to face the self without the comforting distractions of external approval. The modern man's life is engineered to avoid loneliness. Social media, endless entertainment, casual relationships all serve as buffers against the silence. Yet, ironically, these constant connections often deepen the sense of disconnection. Schopenhauer teaches that the will, our blind, incessant craving, drives us to seek fulfillment outside ourselves, creating a vicious cycle where solitude is seen as the enemy. But solitude is not what wounds us. What truly hurts is the confrontation with our own inner emptiness, a void we have spent our lives avoiding. This is why solitude feels so unbearable. It forces us to acknowledge truths we would rather ignore. The fear of loneliness, also stems from a fragile sense of identity. Many men unknowingly build their self-concept on the reflections of others. A relationship becomes not just a connection, but a mirror, validating their worth. Without this mirror, they feel invisible, unworthy, even meaningless. Schopenhauer's view cuts through this illusion, exposing the tragic irony. The more we depend on others to define us, the less we truly know ourselves. Solitude strips away these borrowed identities, leaving the man face to face with the uncomfortable question, who am I when no one is watching? This existential confrontation is precisely why solitude is essential. Schopenhauer argued that only in solitude can a man cultivate genuine self-awareness. Without the noise of societal expectations, he can observe his thoughts, understand his desires, and confront his weaknesses. It is in this space of isolation that philosophical reflection becomes possible, leading not to despair, but to clarity. The man who avoids solitude remains a stranger to himself, perpetually chasing external validation to mask his inner disconnection. The man who embraces it begins the arduous but liberating journey toward self-possession. Yet, the transition from fearing solitude to embracing it is not instantaneous. It requires dismantling deeply ingrained beliefs about worth, connection, and identity. A man must learn to differentiate between loneliness, a craving for external affirmation, and solitude, a chosen space for self-discovery. Schopenhauer's insistence on detachment becomes the guiding principle here. By releasing the compulsion to be constantly seen and validated, a man reclaims his agency. He shifts from being a reactive entity, shaped by the opinions of others, to an active architect of his own identity. In essence, the fear of being alone is not a fear of solitude, it is a fear of self-confrontation. It is the dread of meeting the unfiltered, unvarnished version of oneself without the protective layers of external approval. Schopenhauer's philosophy offers not comfort, but liberation. By facing this fear head-on, a man gains a level of clarity, strength, and authenticity that no relationship can provide. Solitude, far from being a void to escape, becomes a crucible where true masculine identity is forged, not through others, but through the relentless pursuit of inner truth. For many men, the fear of loneliness operates as an invisible prison. Outwardly, they may appear successful, surrounded by friends, involved in relationships, engaged in constant activity. Yet beneath the surface, their lives are governed by an unspoken anxiety, the terror of being left alone with their own thoughts. Schopenhauer would argue that this is not a fear of solitude itself, but of what solitude reveals. The noise of modern life becomes a carefully curated distraction, allowing men to avoid the existential discomfort that silence brings. Every notification, every meaningless interaction serves to postpone the inevitable encounter with oneself. This avoidance has profound consequences. Men who fear solitude often settle for low-quality relationships, staying in connections that drain rather than nourish, simply to avoid the void of being alone. They tolerate disrespect, suppress their needs, and lose themselves in codependent dynamics because the alternative, facing their own emotional landscape, feels unbearable. Schopenhauer's critique of desire applies perfectly here. The compulsive need for connection is not about love or companionship, but about escaping the discomfort of self-awareness. In clinging to others, the man avoids the deeper work of confronting his own insecurities and unmet needs. The emotional toll of this avoidance manifests as chronic anxiety, low self-esteem, and an inability to set boundaries. A man who cannot stand to be alone becomes excessively accommodating, fearing that any assertion of self might lead to rejection and the dreaded return to solitude. Schopenhauer teaches that this is the ultimate form of enslavement, when the will driven by fear overrides reason and self-respect. The man becomes a passive participant in his own life, reacting to external circumstances rather than acting from inner conviction. Furthermore, this fear limits a man's potential for growth. Solitude is where reflection, creativity, and true self-discovery occur. Schopenhauer himself spent much of his life in deliberate isolation, using solitude as a crucible for philosophical clarity. In avoiding solitude, modern men rob themselves of the opportunity to develop independent thought, emotional resilience, and authentic self-confidence. They become echoes of societal expectations, never discovering who they truly are beyond the roles they perform. The social narrative that equates constant connection with happiness exacerbates this issue. Men are subtly shamed for seeking solitude, labeled as loners or antisocial. Yet Schopenhauer's philosophy flips this narrative. It is not the solitary man who is weak, but the man who cannot bear solitude. True strength lies in the ability to stand alone, to find contentment and clarity within oneself without the crutch of external validation. This inner solidity becomes the foundation for all other aspects of life: relationships, career, personal fulfillment. Breaking free from the prison of avoiding solitude requires a deliberate reorientation of values. A man must redefine his relationship with aloneness, not as a sign of failure but as a space for mastery. This shift is uncomfortable but necessary. Schopenhauer's path of detachment provides the roadmap. By releasing the compulsion to escape oneself, a man discovers the depth, strength, and authenticity that constant connection can never offer. In solitude, he stops running from himself and, in doing so, he finds the power to engage with the world from a place of wholeness. The fear of loneliness does more than create emotional discomfort. It systematically erodes a man's masculine identity. Schopenhauer's philosophy reveals why. The man who cannot be alone becomes fundamentally dependent on the perceptions and presence of others to define himself. His self-worth is no longer an internal certainty, but a fragile reflection of external opinions. This dependency makes him reactive, insecure, and easy to manipulate. Every interaction becomes a silent negotiation of worth. The absence of others, is not merely quiet. It becomes an existential crisis, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable void within. Masculine energy at its core is about direction, presence, and internal sovereignty. Yet when a man fears solitude, he forfeits these qualities. His actions become dictated by the need to maintain connection at all costs. He avoids confrontation, hides his true opinions, and compromises his boundaries, not from respect, but from fear of abandonment. Schopenhauer's notion of the will's blind striving applies here. The man becomes enslaved to the relentless urge to escape himself, trading his authenticity for temporary relief from loneliness. This dynamic also distorts relationships. The man who fears being alone often smothers his partner with neediness, mistaking emotional dependence for love. His interactions are loaded with unspoken expectations. Every text reply, every moment of attention becomes a validation checkpoint. But Schopenhauer warns that such compulsive desire inevitably leads to suffering. The more a man clings, the more suffocating his presence becomes. This not only drives others away, but reinforces his internal narrative of unworthiness, deepening the very loneliness he seeks to avoid. Beyond romantic relationships, the fear of solitude affects a man's ability to lead, create, and grow. Leadership demands decisiveness and self-trust, qualities that cannot flourish in a man whose identity dissolves without external affirmation. Creativity, too, requires the courage to explore one's inner world, to sit with discomfort and wrestle with original thought. Schopenhauer's solitary intellectual life exemplifies how profound insights emerge not from constant interaction, but from deep, uninterrupted reflection. The man who shuns solitude limits his potential, trapped in a cycle of superficial validation. Moreover, the avoidance of loneliness cultivates a mindset of scarcity. Every relationship becomes a lifeline, every social interaction a means of survival rather than a space for authentic connection. This scarcity mindset breeds anxiety, jealousy, and emotional volatility. Schopenhauer's philosophy teaches that desire multiplies suffering by convincing us that fulfillment lies outside ourselves. The man ensnared by this illusion becomes perpetually dissatisfied, his emotional state at the mercy of others' attention or lack thereof. True masculine identity is forged not in the noise of constant interaction, but in the quiet crucible of solitude. It is in these moments, when external distractions fade, that a man confronts his fears, examines his desires, and cultivates genuine self-respect. Schopenhauer's path is not easy, but it is liberating. By embracing solitude as a space for self-mastery, a man transforms loneliness from a source of weakness into a foundation of strength. He no longer fears being alone because he no longer fears himself. The transformative potential of solitude is often misunderstood. For Schopenhauer, solitude was not an unfortunate state to be escaped, but an essential condition for philosophical clarity and personal growth. Modern men, however, are conditioned to see aloneness as a failure, a sign of social inadequacy. This cultural narrative blinds them to the immense power that can be cultivated in solitude. The man who dares to face himself without distractions discovers a depth of self-knowledge and inner stability that no external validation can match. Solitude becomes a mirror, not of inadequacy but of potential. When a man embraces solitude, he steps away from the reactive patterns of constant social feedback. He learns to sit with discomfort, to observe his thoughts without judgment, and to confront the fears that lurk beneath his need for connection. Schopenhauer's principle of detachment teaches that desire for external validation only multiplies suffering. In solitude, the man begins to dismantle these desires, exposing them as illusions. What remains is a quieter, more grounded self, not defined by others, but anchored in personal values and clarity. This inner anchoring redefines how a man engages with the world. He no longer enters relationships from a place of neediness or fear of loneliness. Instead, his connections are chosen, not craved. Schopenhauer's critique of blind desire applies perfectly. By releasing the compulsion to seek fulfillment in others, a man gains the freedom to relate authentically. His presence becomes more compelling because it is not burdened by hidden agendas of validation. He offers attention, affection, and respect freely, without the silent contract of complete. Solitude also sharpens a man's vision for his life. Without the noise of constant interaction, he gains the space to reflect on his goals, values, and purpose. Schopenhauer believed that profound understanding arises from contemplation, not from distraction. The man who masters solitude cultivates a strategic long-term mindset, allowing him to make decisions aligned with his true self rather than reactive to immediate emotional needs. This clarity enhances not only his personal life, but also his professional and creative endeavors. Another critical benefit of solitude is emotional resilience. The man who can sit with his own discomfort without seeking immediate escape becomes unshakable. Rejection, criticism, or disapproval no longer destabilize him. Schopenhauer's stoic-like detachment becomes a practical tool for navigating life's inevitable challenges. Emotional independence is forged in these solitary moments, building a quiet confidence that radiates outward. This resilience is attractive, not because it is performed, but because it is real. Ultimately, solitude becomes not a prison, but a sanctuary. It is the space where the man reconnects with himself, heals his emotional wounds, and reclaims his power. Schopenhauer's philosophy teaches that suffering cannot be outsourced. It must be faced and transcended internally. The man who embraces solitude understands this at a visceral level. He stops running from himself and, in doing so, discovers the profound freedom of being fully self-possessed. In this state, he is no longer enslaved by the fear of loneliness, because he has transformed solitude into his greatest ally. Mastering solitude is not the rejection of human connection. It is the foundation that makes genuine connection possible. Schopenhauer's philosophy teaches that only by detaching from illusions of desire can one engage with reality authentically. For the man trapped in the fear of loneliness, this detachment becomes a gateway to emotional freedom. The man who learns to be fully content in his own company no longer approaches relationships from a place of need. He does not seek completion, validation, or escape. Instead, he chooses connection from abundance, not scarcity. This shift redefines attraction. Women, and people in general, are naturally drawn to those who exude quiet confidence, those whose presence is not desperate or demanding. The man who has mastered solitude carries himself differently. His energy is calm, grounded, and self-sufficient. Schopenhauer's concept of the sage applies here. The man who is inwardly free becomes outwardly magnetic, not through force, but through the absence of neediness. His relationships improve because they are no longer burdened by unspoken demands. Moreover, solitude becomes a space for self-cultivation. Schopenhauer himself used solitude to produce profound philosophical works, demonstrating that true creativity and clarity emerge from within, not from constant external stimulation. The modern man who embraces this understands that time alone is an investment, not only in personal growth but in his ability to contribute meaningfully to the world. His solitude sharpens his vision, hones his discipline, and deepens his understanding of himself and others. Emotional sovereignty is the ultimate reward of mastering solitude. The man no longer rides the emotional roller coaster of others' opinions, moods, or approval. Schopenhauer's emphasis on inner detachment becomes a lived reality. This emotional independence fosters resilience, allowing the man to navigate relationships, challenges, and even loss with grace and strength. He remains connected to others, but never enslaved by them. His self-worth is anchored within, making him a stable force in an unstable world. This transformation also enhances his leadership. The man who is comfortable in solitude makes decisions from clarity, not from reactive emotional needs. He leads not to be admired, but because he has a vision aligned with his values. Schopenhauer's critique of herd mentality underscores the importance of this independence. By stepping away from the noise, the man gains perspective, enabling him to see what others lost in constant distraction cannot. In the end, the mastery of being alone is the mastery of self. It is the quiet strength of a man who knows who he is, what he values, and where he is going, regardless of external validation. Schopenhauer's teachings illuminate this path, not as a retreat from life, but as a powerful engagement with its most authentic form. The man who embraces solitude reclaims his freedom, his masculinity, and his peace. In solitude, he no longer fears loneliness because he has found his greatest ally, himself. Loneliness is not your enemy. The real enemy is the illusion that your worth, your identity, and your peace are dependent on the presence and approval of others. Schopenhauer's philosophy strips away this illusion with brutal honesty, revealing that the fear of being alone is, at its core, a fear of facing yourself. Yet paradoxically, it is precisely in solitude where a man discovers his greatest strength. The man who avoids being alone remains a slave to external validation, forever chasing attention, affection, and approval to mask his own internal emptiness. But no relationship, no social circle, no amount of noise can fill a void that was never meant to be filled from the outside. Schopenhauer teaches that desire, unchecked and unexamined, enslaves us, while detachment frees us. Solitude becomes the crucible where this detachment is forged. It is in the silence, away from distractions, that a man confronts his fears, dissolves his illusions, and builds an unshakable foundation of self-respect. This transformation is not about becoming isolated or cold. It is about cultivating emotional sovereignty. When you no longer fear solitude, you no longer fear rejection. You no longer compromise your values for fleeting attention. You engage with others from a place of wholeness, not desperation. Relationships become richer, deeper, and more authentic, not because you need them, but because you choose them. The man who has mastered solitude commands a different kind of respect. His presence is grounded, his words deliberate, his actions aligned. Schopenhauer's life exemplifies this mastery, not as a withdrawal from the world, but as an engagement with it from a place of clarity and inner strength. Imagine living without the constant anxiety of needing to be seen, heard, or validated. Imagine making decisions not from fear of being alone, but from the quiet confidence of someone who has faced himself and emerged stronger. This is not an abstract ideal. It is a practical reality accessible to any man willing to embrace the discomfort of solitude and do the inner work. The uncomfortable, inconvenient truth is that solitude reveals what distraction hides, and in that revelation lies your freedom. By choosing to stop running from yourself, you reclaim your power, your peace, and your true masculine identity. If this message resonates with you, if you're tired of being a prisoner to the fear of loneliness, it's time to take the first step toward emotional independence. Subscribe to this channel for more content that cuts through illusions and builds real masculine strength. Hit the like button to support this journey and share this video with a brother who needs this wake-up call. Together, we're not escaping loneliness, we're mastering it. You don't need the world to validate you, you just need to face yourself.